Well, we start here tonight. The National Economic Development and Labour Council today held its 27th summit, where it took stock of how South Africa responded to economic shocks such as the COVID-19 pandemic, the July unrest, and the current state of the South African economy. Social partners were there from civil society and labour unions, including business and government, to thrash out policy inputs for the country going forward. Lisa Seftel is the Executive Director at Nedlac, and she joins us now. Lisa, thank you very much for joining us this evening. There's a lot to go through and assess in terms of how government has responded to some of the economic shocks in the past year or two. What is the work that's been done that we have looked at as Nedlac when it comes to COVID-19, and how do you assess how the South African government actually responded?
Well, you know, I think if we all recall COVID, even though some of us would like to forget it, there were many, many facets that one had to consider. And there were many responses that were required from government. Initially, there was the need to lock down, and then after that, it was the need to open up the economy safely, and then there was the vaccination program. So, and a lot of this work was done with a very constructive partnership between organized business, organized labor, community, and government. So I suppose when we reflect on it, we're also reflecting on the work not only of government, on our social partners. And I think that the consensus was particularly, the consensus was that we couldn't have done anything different. We really did well. There was significant building of trust and partnership, which should be a role model for other parts, for dealing with other crises. But that, despite how hard we worked, you know, there's always a difference between effort and impact. So, for example, there was a lot of mobilization to get people to vaccinate, yet our vaccination rates were not high. We tried really hard to introduce social distancing with measures like curfews and restriction of gatherings, but it was very hard, particularly to enforce some of these measures.
Let's talk about the Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan by President Cyril Ramaphosa. That was actually announced as a response to the COVID-19 slump. The economy recovered, when it comes to the first quarter of this year, 1.5 million jobs since the height of the lockdown in quarter 2, 2020. However, at the end of quarter 2, 2022, total employment was still 900,000 below pre-COVID-19 levels. It seems that economically we haven't done well, or we have lost those gains that we saw in that recovery.
Well, I think that is true, and it is a view of the social partners that we could and we should be doing better if it wasn't for a number of very significant constraints in respect of energy, the movement of freight, productivity of workers, enabling SMMEs, and so on. And that's really been the focus of the social partners at Nedlac, to try and look at how to unblock issues and how to collaborate to improve the functioning and the enabling environment for the economy to grow. But it is a big concern, not only from the past, but going forward, that we're seeing jobless growth, and we're seeing a very different kind of growth, particularly as a result of some of the geopolitical forces and the digitalization, the shift to remote work, and so on.
Lisa, the ratio of the unemployed to the employed rose from 51% at the end of 2015 to 86% in quarter 4, 2021. These are Nedlac's assessments when it comes to unemployment. How is your assessment in terms of policy inputs that South Africa has to follow in order to put a dent on unemployment going forward? Because it seems no matter what South Africa does in policy-wise, the unemployment rate remains elevated.
Absolutely, and that is a big constraint. So, in Nedlac, there isn't necessarily one view, but I must say one of the things that the community constituency articulated today is that to address this high level of unemployment, we can't only focus on enabling economic growth, but also need to look very importantly at issues of social relief to be able to help people out of poverty. And there was also a focus in the Nedlac Summit on informal work and how many people are in informal work, which often is also almost, is not necessarily decent work at this point in time.
Let's talk about households now. We saw that since the start of 2015, consumer prices have risen at a faster rate, 43% compared to the nominal GDP per capita at 36%. This is obviously placing a huge financial strain on households, limiting their capacity to actually spend more money. This is not good at all when you look at the inflation rate as well, despite the fact that it is at a lower rate than countries like Turkey, China, the US, and UK. That response by the Reserve Bank in terms of the monetary policy, how do you assess it thus far?
Look, in Nedlac we have organized labor and business who really have different views about the role of monetary policy. But I think there is a growing consensus that we need to do things proactively to mitigate the high cost of living, which is impacting on poverty and hunger.
Let's talk about the social compact now, something that many South Africans want to know more about, exactly what it is and where exactly Nedlac is in terms of getting that social compact, because there are a lot of policy proposals that are taking place. We saw from the presidency and National Treasury the new grant system that they are proposing. What is at play here when it comes to that social compact, and how far is Nedlac in actually getting it done?
Well, as the Minister of Employment and Labour, Thulas Ngesi, said this morning, it's work in progress. That there is consensus on a number of areas of which historically there's been consensus on to get the economy growing, but there's also difficult areas. And I think it would be important that the social compact is made a social compact when there is able to be that compacting on the easy issues and the difficult issues.
And let's talk about what the minister also called on when it comes to Nedlac, the issue of the new bill on employment and migration, to deal with some of the migration issues that many South Africans are actually complaining about. Let's talk about how far Nedlac is in coming together and supporting that particular bill. Where are the stumbling blocks or the bottlenecks when it comes to this particular bill? Because the issue of migration is on a day-to-day basis becoming very topical.
Absolutely. And the minister did raise the importance of us as in Nedlac looking at this legislation speedily. However, at the moment, Nedlac did get a presentation of the key tenets of both the policy and the bill. And then the department went out for public comments. As I understand at the moment, they're processing their public comments and then are going to request that the social partners at Nedlac look at the bill speedily so that it can proceed to Parliament.
How does Nedlac view the fact that government has had to borrow on average 24.3 billion rands per month to fill the gap between revenue and expenditure up to June 2022? Is there a concern that even when it comes to the average financing requirement, there is a lot that government is committing itself to? Your thoughts on that as Nedlac?
Well, again, in Nedlac there's different views. I think particularly from the organized business, they're very concerned about the fiscal constraints and the impact that it has on the investment environment. When it comes to particularly organized labor and community, their view is more that government has a responsibility to address poverty and employment and should not be overly concerned about some of the fiscal constraints. So it is an ongoing debate and an ongoing dialogue about how one engages and how one provides input to ultimately the Minister of Finance, who has to make these hard decisions.
Lisa, before I let you go, what can you tell us about the latest in terms of that mandatory vaccination, which is still there? And there were discussions at Nedlac, and there are differing views about whether government can legislate and mandate vaccinations throughout. I wanted to ask you that question about where Nedlac is, and also it seems COVID-19 is not with us anymore. Some would think, although in some quarters there is a view that we are still going to experience some shocks and some waves going forward. What are your thoughts on that? Can we safely say that COVID-19 is now behind us?
Well, no. I think many of the speakers this morning were saying that COVID is with us and that it will always be a workplace issue. Whether it's about transmission or whether it's about affecting productivity due to absenteeism, it is a workplace issue, and employers need to take measures to ensure that their workplace is safe. And that is something really new that has come up, that occupational health and safety is not only an issue of construction and chemicals, but of infectious diseases, and also, as was raised this morning, of mental health. So the issue of mandatory vaccination, I think that government is not saying that they want to make a law about, that you must vaccinate. But I think there's a code of good practice around the management of COVID in the workplace, which really says that an employer has an obligation on the workplace to be safe. And if vaccination is a measure that will make the workplace safe, then it is something that the employer, in consultation with employees, can introduce in the workplace.
Lisa Seftel is Executive Director at the National Economic Development and Labour Council, joining us to talk about their assessment that was released today in terms of the 27th summit, which was held today here in Gauteng.